In the autumn of 1884, the most powerful nations in Europe gathered in the German city of Berlin. They came not to discuss war, not to negotiate peace, and not to address any crisis among themselves. They came to divide a continent that none of them fully understood, a continent most of them had never set foot in among themselves. The continent was Africa. And what happened in that conference room between November 1884 and February 1885 would reshape the lives of hundreds of millions of people for generations to come. The borders drawn on those maps, often with nothing more than a ruler and a pen, cut through kingdoms, divided ethnic groups, separated families, and created nations that had never existed before. Many of the conflicts that plague Africa today, the civil wars, the ethnic tensions, the political instability, trace their roots directly back to those 70 days in Berlin. To understand why Europe gathered in Berlin in 1884, you must first understand what Africa looked like before the Europeans arrived in force, and what had been building for decades before that fateful conference. Africa in the early 19th century was not an empty or ungoverned land. It was a continent of extraordinary political complexity. Powerful kingdoms and empires governed vast territories with sophisticated systems of law, trade, and diplomacy. The Ashanti Empire in present-day Ghana commanded one of the most disciplined armies in West Africa and controlled the gold trade that had made the region wealthy for centuries. The Kingdom of Benin in present-day Nigeria had a royal court of such refinement that when Portuguese diplomats first visited in the 15th century, they were astonished by its organization and the quality of its art. The Zulu Kingdom in southern Africa had built a military machine so formidable that it would later defeat a British army in open battle. The Ethiopian Empire in the Horn of Africa had maintained its independence and its ancient Christian tradition for over 1,000 years. The Sokoto Caliphate in northern Nigeria was one of the largest states in the world, governing millions of people under a sophisticated Islamic legal framework. These were not primitive societies waiting to be civilized. They were functioning states with their own histories, their own institutions, and their own futures. But Europe saw something different. By the middle of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had transformed European economies. Factories needed raw materials: cotton, rubber, palm oil, copper, gold, and ivory. Markets needed customers for manufactured goods. And European navies needed coaling stations and strategic ports along the sea routes that connected their growing empires. Africa, with its vast resources and its coastline stretching across 2 oceans, offered all of these things. At the same time, advances in medicine, particularly the use of quinine to treat malaria, had made it possible for Europeans to survive in the African interior in ways that had previously been impossible. Before quinine, the West African coast had been known to European sailors as the white man's grave. Disease had killed European soldiers and traders so efficiently that deep penetration of the continent had been largely impractical. Quinine changed that calculation entirely. The result was a dramatic acceleration of European interest in Africa during the 1870s and 1880s. British traders and soldiers were pushing inland from their coastal footholds in West Africa and from the Cape Colony in the south. French forces were expanding east from Senegal into the Sahel. Portuguese colonists were extending their presence in Angola and Mozambique. King Leopold II of Belgium, acting in his personal capacity rather than as a representative of the Belgian state, had hired the explorer Henry Morton Stanley to establish a private commercial empire in the Congo Basin, claiming it under the flag of a body he called the International Association of the Congo. It was this scramble, this rush of competing European ambitions in Africa, that made the Berlin Conference necessary in the eyes of its organizer, the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck himself had little personal interest in acquiring African colonies. Germany had come late to the colonial game, and he was primarily concerned with European stability. But he recognized that the competing claims of Britain, France, Portugal, and Leopold's private enterprise in the Congo were creating dangerous tensions that could destabilize European diplomacy. A conference, he calculated, would allow these competing powers to establish rules for the carve-up of Africa before those competitions spilled over into conflicts between European states. Invitations were sent to 14 nations: Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States. Every major European power was represented. The United States attended as an observer. Not a single African ruler, diplomat, or representative of any kind was invited. The people whose land was being divided, whose kingdoms were being erased, whose futures were being determined, had no voice in the proceedings whatsoever. The conference opened on the 15th of November 1884 in Bismarck's official residence in Berlin. The delegates gathered around a large map of Africa. It was not a particularly accurate map. Large portions of the African interior were still unknown to European cartographers, marked simply with vague descriptions or left blank entirely. The delegates would draw lines across these blank spaces with the confidence of men who believed that what they did not know could not matter. The conference addressed three main issues. The first was the question of free trade and free navigation on the Congo and Niger rivers. The European powers agreed that these waterways should be open to the trade of all nations, a principle that served their commercial interests while doing nothing for the African peoples who lived along those rivers. The second issue was the suppression of the slave trade and the promotion of what the delegates called the moral and material well-being of the native populations. This language of humanitarian concern sat comfortably alongside the reality that the conference was facilitating the largest land grab in human history. The third and most consequential issue was the principle of effective occupation. This principle, agreed upon by all the delegates, stated that a European power could only claim sovereignty over African territory if it could demonstrate that it was actually present there and exercising authority. Merely planting a flag or signing a treaty with a local chief was no longer sufficient. A power had to show that it had established administration, maintained order, and was capable of protecting existing rights and freedom of trade. The principle of effective occupation, while it sounded procedurally reasonable, had an enormous practical consequence. It triggered a race. Every European power now had an incentive to rush into Africa and establish a physical presence before a rival power could claim the same territory. The conference, which Bismarck had intended to reduce competition, actually accelerated it dramatically. Over the following 15 years, European powers scrambled to occupy as much African territory as possible. British forces pushed north from South Africa and south from Egypt, aiming to create an unbroken chain of British territory from Cairo to Cape Town. The French expanded east from West Africa and north from the Congo, seeking to create their own unbroken band of territory from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. These two imperial visions collided in 1898 at a small town called Fashoda in present-day South Sudan, bringing Britain and France to the brink of war before France backed down. The borders that emerged from this scramble were drawn with almost complete disregard for the peoples who lived within them. The European cartographers and diplomats in Berlin and in the subsequent treaties that followed worked primarily from geographical features, rivers, mountain ranges, and lines of latitude and longitude, rather than from any knowledge of the political, ethnic, or cultural realities on the ground. The results were catastrophic in human terms. The Somali people were divided among British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, and the Ethiopian Empire. The Maasai people found themselves split between British East Africa and German East Africa. The Iwi people were divided between British Gold Coast and German Togoland. The Bakongo people, whose kingdom had once been one of the most powerful states in Central Africa, were divided among French Congo, Belgian Congo, and Portuguese Angola. Across the continent, the pattern repeated itself with brutal consistency. Peoples who had shared language, culture, religion, and political identity for centuries were placed on opposite sides of lines drawn by strangers who had never met them. At the same time, peoples who had been historical rivals or enemies, who had fought each other for generations over land, water, and trade routes, were placed inside the same colonial borders and told they were now a single nation. These artificial groupings would create tensions that would not fully explode until the colonial powers withdrew in the 20th century, leaving behind states whose borders made no cultural or political sense, with populations that had no shared history of living together under a single government. If you enjoy watching it and learn something from it, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel.